Why is understanding the new creation so important to properly understanding this specific topic? And what are some of the scriptures that you would point to for this?
Yes. It's a fantastic question, and here's my thought, Miles. Let's plan to go deep on that question, that new creation piece. I'll talk around it a bit here, but let's go to those scriptures in a little bit, because one of the things many Seventh-day people have appreciated how powerful this redemptive historical argument is for when we ought to worship. That God has always anchored our worship day in his mighty deeds in human history, or at the very beginning of history. And some of these people, therefore, both Seventh-day Adventists and Worldwide Church of God devotees, have developed arguments to the effect that Jesus did not rise on the first day of the week. And so if you don't mind, I'm going to try to take us in that direction for a little bit. And then afterwards, we'll talk about how the Sabbath looks forward to certain things, how worship days always look forward, not only backward. And we'll talk a little bit more about new creation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Well, so, first off, just a passing observation, I would just note that Seventh-day people understand something of the implications of what I'm saying, because when they meet on the seventh day, Lord willing, their worship services are not fundamentally centered on the mighty work of God in creating the world in 6 days and resting on the seventh. They're also not fundamentally orbiting around, Lord willing, God's redemption of Israel from the national Egypt. Hopefully, they're worshiping about the completed work of Jesus Christ on the cross. And of course, we have trouble with even the concept of completed work with the doctrines of the investigative judgment and things like that. If you don't know what I meant, you're listening, then forget it. That's a whole nother episode. But my point is, most people who profess the name of Christ, whether first or seventh day, get it, that when we gather together as a church, our focus actually shouldn't be the things that are mentioned in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 with respect to the fourth commandment. Our focus should be proclamation of the good news of a totally new thing having been accomplished in Jesus Christ. But once you admit that, once you say that that should be the focus of our worship, it stands to reason, and in accordance with the entire analogy of Scripture, that the very day of worship would be altered so as to commemorate that specific event, to coincide with when that mighty deed of God, the God-man Jesus Christ, occurred. And hence we would expect for there to be a new sort of worship. And you had mentioned earlier, a new creation. I mean, the concept in 2 Corinthians 5:17, that if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creature. The old things have passed away. Behold, new things have come. Now all these things are from God, who reconciled us to himself. Here he's saying something new has come, whereby men have been reconciled to God, God not counting their trespasses against them, and all of that in Christ. If new things have come, things have been made new, a mighty deed, an unprecedented deed of God has occurred in human history, then the most intuitive thing for any Bible reader to conclude is that we must have worship that centers around that thing, and that the timing of it would reflect that. And so here's the thing, though, as alluded to, a case is frequently made to the effect that Jesus did not rise from the dead on the first day, chiefly from those who come from either a Messianic Christian perspective. So I've seen Messianic Jews make this argument. I've seen Worldwide Church of God advocates make this argument in an article that is on the internet. I don't know if you want to put in your comments or something for people to look at, but that I've drawn up is directed against the arguments developed by a man named Richard T. Rittenbaugh, who's a Worldwide Church of God member. But the argument that they make, it tends to center on Matthew 12:40. So I'm just going to go ahead and read that. In this passage, it says, "For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." The argument that gets made is that this requires Jesus' body to have been in the tomb for 72 hours, as if 3 days and 3 nights carried with it a strict 72-hour time frame. And the argument is that this can't coincide with the classic versions of the Holy Week, where we have Jesus eating some sort of a pre-Passover, replacement Passover meal, you could call it, on Thursday evening, which would have been at the beginning of the day we call Nisan 14. And then Jesus is crucified on the day of Nisan 14, which would be the day of preparation for the Passover. And then he's in the grave for Saturday and then rises again on Sunday. That you wouldn't have a full 72 hours in the heart of the earth if that were the case. And I'm just curious, Miles, have you ever come across this sort of thinking?
Most definitely. I know there's some people that view the channel. I don't know if they necessarily are getting this from that individual. But yeah, I've heard that from people outside of YouTube, as well as people that watch this channel that sort of use the same argumentation along those lines.
Perfect. Well, yeah, then a link to that article will be super helpful, and I can get you one a little later. But here are the sorts of observations that we have to make. I mean, this argument is entirely misguided. There are other supportive pieces of evidence that they try to throw out there, but they generally take this as the ground for tossing out the classic, idea of Holy Week and what transpired in it. And then as the alternative theory goes, typically they'll try to argue that Jesus was rather crucified on a Wednesday, that Thursday was, I'm about to get jumbled here. Just real quick. No, crucified on a Thursday, that I've got to get my own diagram up here. That's what you've got to do. Just a second.
No, you're good.
Just a second. Yes, no, it's going to be that. Be sure that Jesus was crucified allegedly on a Wednesday. On Thursday, there was the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Friday in between is kind of a free day where people could do stuff. And then Saturday is the seventh-day Sabbath. And then Jesus is raised from the dead. They will usually argue around 6 p.m. on Saturday, crucified around 6 p.m., or actually buried and dead at 6 p.m. on Wednesday, making for a full 72 hours. Now, there's almost no evidence, anything you could even point to support this scheme. We'll talk about what they do. But I want to say a few things about just the argument that 3 days and 3 nights, it has to equal 72 hours. There's no way that you can read the Gospels as if this were the case. Many, many, many more scriptures say that Jesus was going to rise from the dead on the third day after his death and crucifixion. There's no way to be in the grave for 72 hours and rise from the dead on the third day after you are crucified. It's just simply mathematically impossible. You can't do it. And so that sort of bizarre number crunching that often goes on, I should say, in Seventh-day Adventism and in such circles it's grossly mistaken. But the biggest problem is the failure to recognize this common biblical phenomenon of counting lengths, distances, and time frames either inclusively or exclusively. And we do this on such a regular basis, day to day, that we miss it. But we all count things slightly differently, especially when it comes to spanning a partial unit or a partial standard unit of space or time. I'll give you an example. I asked my kids recently, if we were to count how many steps we had on our stairway, should you count the bottom floor and should you count the top floor? I'm just curious. What would you be inclined to do, Miles?
I've never actually been asked this question before. And when you're posing it, I'm like, man, that's kind of like a deep question to be asking your kids, And so I don't know. Yeah. I guess my gut response would be, no, you don't count them.
You don't count them. So you only count the ones in between. It was funny. When I asked my kids this, they said, if I'm on the bottom floor, I would count all the steps in between and the top floor, because it's like I lifted my leg to get up on that step, but I wouldn't count the bottom floor. Just the same, I think people might be inclined to say, if I'm going down the stairs, I'm not going to count the step I'm standing on at the top, and I'm going to count every step in between and maybe the bottom floor. Bottom line is, there are 3 different ways you could count your stair steps. You could do it Maximally inclusive would be to count the bottom floor and the top floor and every step in between. And maybe you have an 18 step staircase. Minimally inclusively would be to only count the bottom or count the top, depending on whether you're going up or down. And exclusive counting would only involve everything in between. Well, here's the thing. All of those are legitimate ways to count something. One of the things that arises in Old Testament studies when you're trying to date events and kind of line them up with other secular histories is that Egyptians would antedate a king's reign. What that means is that if a king began to reign in succession of his father in June of 2023, they would count the next 6 months as his first year. And then his second year would begin on New Year's Day, and they would go forward. Well, the Babylonians did the exact opposite. The new king began reigning in the middle of the year. They would count the next 6 months as a 0. And then his first year of his regency would begin on New Year's following those first 6 months. Both of those are reasonable ways of counting, but of course you can imagine how that would muck things up if you're trying to correlate different time frames. Well, the Bible validates both inclusive and exclusive counting. And that accounts for how sometimes Jesus' stay in the tomb can be described as 3 days and 3 nights. That's an inclusive way of describing a burial that spanned 3 days and just calling it 3 full days. Sometimes it's described exclusively, so that when it says that Jesus is going to rise from the dead on the 3rd day, there it's clear that the time frame within which he's in the tomb is going to have to be shorter than a full 72 hours. And one of the best ways to see that this is, those are both perfectly legitimate ways of describing something, is by considering other time frames in the Bible. I would ask you this, Miles, how many days was it between Peter's confession of Christ at Caesarea Philippi and the Transfiguration? Do you know how many days elapsed in between?
I don't.
Yeah, well, okay, that's fine. Matthew 17:1 and Mark 9:2 says that 6 days elapsed. It says after 6 days. You know what they're clearly trying to do, by the way, is correlate Jesus going up the high mountain as himself a theophany to his disciples with when Moses goes up in Exodus 24:17. Oh, yeah, because it says specifically that the cloud rested for 6 days, and then it's only on the 7th day that he gets to go up.
Awesome.
So that's clearly what they're trying to do. But here's the thing. If you read Luke 9:28, it says that it was about 8 days after Peter's confession that Jesus went up the Mount of Transfiguration. The one is clearly counting days with exclusive of the two events between which the time period elapses. The other one is counting it inclusively, and Luke just has a different purpose. He has a different aim. His aim is he wants you to see Jesus' transfiguration as an anticipation of Jesus' resurrection glory, which will also happen on an 8th day. That's the first day of the week in Luke 24:1. He's trying to say, this is the glorious Lord that is going to be revealed more fully on the big 8th day, the first day, which is so emphasized all throughout the New Testament. But the point is, 2 different ways of counting something are perfectly legitimate. And for the purposes of an author to make different theological or typological points, you might use the one or the other. That this is the case is just painfully obvious all throughout the Bible when you actually start reading it seriously. Esther, for example, instructs her companions to fast for 3 days and 3 nights before she goes and encounters the king with a special request. But it says, so that's Esther 4:16, fast for 3 days, night and day. But it says in chapter 5, verse 1, on the 3rd day, she went to the king. So she's going to the king in the midst of this fasting intercession on the 3rd day, overlapping with some of it. And so we can both describe things as, as 3 full days and 3 nights when the big pivotal event occurs within that time frame, as opposed to fully and completely after it.
Mm.
Same thing occurs with Joseph's brothers. It says in Genesis 42:17 that he had them in prison for 3 days. And it says in 42:18 that he released them on the third day. In my article, I have like 20 instances of this sort of phenomenon. But my point is this: there is no contradiction of the traditional straightforward passion narrative that has Jesus crucified on a Friday, in the grave all of Saturday, and rising early on Sunday. None at all. And, the only thing I would observe further is, we only need to ask, what is the theological intent of Matthew in so describing the time frame of Jesus' burial as 3 days and 3 nights? Why does he elect to use this sort of inclusive time frame to describe it that way? And I would submit the answer is straightforward. First of all, to allude to Jonah's 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. But that only pushes the question back a little bit further. Why did Jonah describe his descent into the abyss in the fish that way? And the answer is to connect both Jesus and Jonah with the third day of creation. There we have 3 days, all in succession, described as a day and a night, an evening and a morning. And what happens the third day of creation? Well, earth is raised up above the chaos of the seas. And not only that does dry land appear, and of course, men are made of dust. And so these two men are brought up from the abyss, you could say, from death to life. But on the third day, God, it's the first time he creates a living thing in the material creation. All of the seed-bearing plants begin to spring forth, and life is now on the earth. So Jesus' third day resurrection is described as happening as a 3 day and 3 night thing to allude to this work of creation, and for it to be apparent that Jesus is the ultimate sort of third day injection of life into reality, and rising again